Late one night, when I was 10 years old, after everyone was asleep, I snuck into my dad's living room and I watched The Exorcist. I had no idea how I even knew about that movie or what possessed me to watch it, but all I know is that it left me with nightmares for weeks, and it just scared the living daylights out of me. There was something about this child being possessed by the devil. What if I became possessed by some dark force inside me? And what if that darkness that I saw in that movie actually existed in the real world? It was one of the first times I realized the power fear could have over me, but it didn't stop me a few weeks later from watching Poltergeist. My fears have changed at different stages in my life. In my early 20s, after I had studied neuroscience and behavioral biology at Emory, I realized that I didn't want to become a doctor anymore, and I had to ask myself, now what? Now what am I going to do with my life? And many years later, after Julia gave birth to our third daughter, Rebecca, there were some very scary complications, and an entirely new set of fears emerged, and luckily she was okay. There's a phrase used in the military and by doctors in the ER. Don't just do something, stand there. It's a reminder that before you act, you should assess the situation and consider your next step very carefully. And that's exactly what we did last night when we began Yom Kippur, or as it's known by its other name, Yom Hadin, our Day of Judgment. We stood before that empty ark with the haunting melody of Kol Nidre playing, and we began the process of assessing our flaws and our fears. Now, this assessment reaches its climax with the Unatana Tokef prayer, the one that asks, who shall live and who shall die? We spend most of the year lulled into a false sense of security that we are in control, and this prayer reminds us we're not. It forces us to face our mortality and the dangers inherent in life, and it systematically walks through all the fears that our ancestors must have had on a daily basis. When it was written, a person was lucky to live past the age of 35. I mean, if you traveled outside your town, you could easily be murdered by a band of robbers. And if you wandered into the forest after dark, there is definitely a chance you could be mauled by a wild animal. And if you broke the law, you could literally be stoned to death. And if you lived near a body of water, a torrential downpour could destroy your entire village. In this prayer, fear after fear was laid out for the entire community to hear and consider. The Unatana Tokef states, who will live and who will die, who by water, who by fire, who by war, who by beast. Our fears may be different than those of our ancestors, but we definitely have more than our fair share in the modern world. Our modern Unatana Tokef would sound something like this. Who by nuclear and chemical warfare? Who by terrorism and who by gun violence? Who by global warming and environmental catastrophe? Who by anti-Semitism? Who by the destruction of Israel or the collapse of our own political system? Who by not providing enough for their children or their grandchildren? Who by not doing the work that they love? Who by economic instability or collapse? Who by cancer? Who by heart attack? Who by dying alone? Who by collision? Who by addiction? Who by silenced? And who by not being taken seriously? Who by fear of getting caught? Who by not being loved? And who by feeling invisible? Our fears are a mix of internal and external challenges. First, we articulate them, and we admit to their existence. But we are an action-based religion. Thinking and saying something is not enough. The Unatana Tokef prayer ends by moving us from assessment to action. So today, we move from last night's don't just do something, stand there, to the even more important, don't just stand there, do something. And this prayer tells us exactly how to do it. It ends by reminding us that teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah will limit the severity of God's decree. Three things that will influence just how powerful and prominent we allow those fears to be in our lives. The most basic translation of teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah is repentance, prayer, and charity. But we miss the brilliance of this prayer when we translate these words so narrowly. I have a theory. I have a theory that when we understand them more broadly, we discover that our ancestors were actually teaching us that all of our fears can be addressed by at least one of these three central concepts. These ways of living are not going to stop stock market crashes or brain cancer or the other challenges that are bound to come our way, but they can radically transform how we are affected by those blows and the fear that they strike in us. The first way to combat our fears is teshuvah. We think of teshuvah as repentance, but it should be more broadly defined as contemplation of our own potential. Because teshuvah is the process by which we take steps to return to our true selves, our ideal state of being. There was a woman who came to meet with me about her recent divorce. She was afraid that she was never going to be able to find another partner and that she would be alone for the rest of her life and that her two young children wouldn't have a positive father figure in their lives. So we spent time talking about what she used to love doing before she got married, what went wrong in the relationship, and how she had lost track of the priorities that she had set for herself. We spoke about the challenges and the fears she faced trying to balance her personal and professional goals. But once she began returning to the core of who she was, her dreams, her passions, her lifelong priorities, she was ready to open up her heart and her mind to a new partnership. In his newest book, David Brooks writes about two mountains. The first is the mountain we climb to attain success and wealth and prestige and respect. And the second mountain, which usually comes into our life after a valley-like moment, is the mountain where we find our true self, where we move beyond the fears and expectations related to the outside world into a place of personal rediscovery. As one rabbi put it, too many people die in their 30s and we don't bury them until they're in their 90s. Teshuvah. Contemplate your own potential. The second way of managing our fears is tefillah. And tefillah is more than prayer. It is developing and living a spiritual life. A spiritual life is one in which we understand we are not the center of the world. We are part of something so much bigger than ourselves. And that gratitude for what we have in our life is so important. There was a father who came to speak to me about his food addiction. He had been in and out of Overeaters Anonymous for years, and he was successful in his profession. He had a beautiful family, and yet he felt completely lost. He was scared that his addiction was always going to hold him back from all that he wanted to accomplish as a father, as a husband, as a businessman. He was going to OA meetings. He had a sponsor. He was meeting regularly with a therapist. and I was curious why he wanted to come and meet with me. Because I'm afraid I'm missing something. I've done everything I'm supposed to, and I'm still struggling. There must be a missing piece, he told me. Over the course of several meetings, we discussed faith, where and when he found joy, the moments when he felt connected to something bigger, when he felt inspired. He talked about hiking along the coast, about the almost spiritual exhilaration he got from his soul cycle class, about the precious times that he spent with his family. We looked at some spiritual practices that would help him gain a little bit more sense of gratitude and more awe. He still goes to meetings. He still has those moments where he breaks down, but now he says a blessing before he eats. It adds intentionality to his relationship with food, and every night he says the Shema with his children, reminding him of how lucky he is to have them in his life. Tefillah has helped him value his life, his family, himself. The benefits of tefillah, of spiritual practice, are exponential. The Unatana Tokef's final prescription for a less fearful life is tzedakah. Tzedakah is more than just charity. It is the engagement in meaningful opportunities to provide for others. According to the Talmud, it is equivalent to all other mitzvot in the Torah. And the great rabbinic sage Hillel said, the more tzedakah, the more peace. And another rabbi put it, people are worthy of being called truly human only when they engage in tzedakah. I've noticed a common fear among many of the B'nai Mitzvah families with whom I've worked over the last several years. They're afraid that their children are growing up in an extremely insular bubble, unexposed to the complexities and the diversity of our city, let alone the world. And what's so wonderful is that these families are proactively combating that fear by doing more than just raising money for charities. They are going out into our city with their children, and they are doing all kinds of incredible nonprofit and volunteer work. And as a result, it's not just the children's eyes that are opened, it's the adults' eyes too. Combating our fears, whether it be global warming, political divisiveness, anti-Semitism, anti-Israel rhetoric, or others, with action, by creating the change that you want to see, it is one of the greatest gifts that we can give ourselves. You don't have to go far, considering that we, as a synagogue, have decided that the fears around issues of hunger and poverty and class can be addressed directly through a partnership between our community and the surrounding neighborhood. I know Karsh would be thrilled to have you. When we tap into our own potential, whether it be to learn something new, to work on our own habits, we are utilizing the process of teshuvah. With tefillah, we develop spiritual practices that build up internal strength and gratitude and awe and resilience. And when we put our money, or our most precious resource, our time, into a cause that truly matters to us, we honor our tradition's central tenet of tzedakah. Through these acts of teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, we move from fear being in control to having a little bit more control over our fears. Use these tools this year. When fear creeps in, and it will, ask yourself, what am I going to do to combat this fear? Is it teshuvah? Is it tefillah? Is it tzedakah? When fear creeps in, don't just stand there. Do something. Gemar Chatima Tova.